Today, a man named William Clay Ford Jr. sits as executive chairman of the Ford Motor Company, the same family that signed it into being by the company's own count more than 121 years ago. The Fords are still in the chair, and yet the last time Forbes counted them among America's richest families, it placed them at number 129. The company stayed in the family. The fortune did not. This is the story of one of the largest fortunes ever built in America, and how it left the family that made it. Not in a crash, the company never went broke. Not in a scandal, not in a courtroom, not through a fool of an heir who gambled it away. The Fords lost this fortune the way almost no family ever loses one. On purpose, in the open, with a few signatures. They gave the money away to keep something they wanted more. This is how one of the great industrial families chose the company over the cash, and what that choice cost them. You have heard there was a Ford fortune. What nobody could ever tell you is how big it was, because for 37 years the Ford Motor Company was owned outright by the family, published no accounts, and Henry Ford never once disclosed what he held. In 1926, the Treasury's own actuary reported that a single American was a billionaire and refused to name him. The newspapers guessed all season at whether the man was Ford or Rockefeller. Nobody knew, not even the government. There is only one honest way to measure it, and it comes late. In January of 1956, for the first time in its history, the stock market at last put a price on the Ford Motor Company. Measured against the size of the economy it sat inside, the company the family built was worth about $220 billion in today's terms, a fortune second only to Rockefeller's. And here is the correction that is the whole point of this story. By the time the market first priced that fortune, the family had already given 9/10 of it away. So where did it go? This is the puzzle. The family never sold the company, they hold it to this day. The company never went broke. It builds trucks by the million right now. No crash carried it off, no swindler, no scandal. And still, 9/10 of the greatest fortune the automobile ever made left the family that owned it. Nothing was done to the Fords. They did not do to themselves. The question is why? The answer is paper, a few pages drawn up in the 1930s. A stock restructuring, a charter, a set of wills, signed by a father and son who knew full well what they were doing. Remember that paper. It would carry 9/10 of an empire out of a family forever, wholly within the law. Rewind to the man. Henry Ford was a Dearborn farmer's son who cared for little but machines. On the 16th of June, 1903, he and 11 others founded the Ford Motor Company with about $28,000. And here, everyone forgets, Ford did not control it. He held 255 of 1,000 shares, the same stake as a Detroit coal dealer named Malcolmson. But he learned. He built the Model T in 1908, a car cheap enough for an ordinary family. In 1913, he put it on a moving assembly line and cut the build time from more than 12 hours to 93 minutes. In January of 1914, he announced the $5 day, $5 for 8 hours work, up from $2.34 for 9. It was not a raise. Most of it was a bonus a worker got only if Ford's inspectors visited his home and liked what they found inside. The car made the fortune, and the fortune ran on control. Here's what Henry Ford understood, a thing his heirs would inherit as a story and never quite as an instinct. To him, the company was not an investment. It was not even a business as such. It was himself, cast in steel, and he would sooner have burned it to the ground than share the wheel of it. He set it down in his own book in 1922. "I determined absolutely," he said, "that never would I join a company in which finance came before the work, or in which bankers or financiers had a part." He meant it as a law of nature. Other men built companies and then sold pieces of them off to raise money and spread the risk. Ford refused. When Wall Street whispered that the company was bound to be short of cash, he did not trouble himself to answer. "Last year, the best-liked rumor was that we were down in Wall Street hunting for money," he wrote. "I did not bother to deny that. It takes too much time to deny everything. Instead, we demonstrated that we did not need any money." He was not, he insisted, an enemy of bankers as such. "We are not against borrowing money. and we are not against bankers, he wrote. We are against trying to make borrowed money take the place of work. Sharper still, we are against the kind of banker who regards a business as a melon to be cut. What he wanted was total command, and he imagined a whole world reordered so that he would have it. Banks will no longer be the masters of industry, he promised. They will be the servants of industry. Business will control money instead of money controlling business. This was the man's true religion, not wealth, but control. And it explains everything that is coming. When the moment came to choose between the money and the wheel, a Ford would always, every single time, without hesitation, let the money go. By the 1920s, the machine had swallowed the industry whole. The Model T had put an entire country on wheels, and Ford built them faster and cheaper than anyone alive. To see what that meant, in steel and brick, you went to the River Rouge. At the time, it was the largest factory in the world, well over 1,000 acres of it, more than 100,000 men at its peak, 120 miles of conveyor belt threading through the buildings, 100 miles of private railroad running between them. Iron ore and coal and sand went in at one end. Finished automobiles rolled out of the other. Ford's own flowchart boasted that a complete car could be built, from raw material to running machine, in 28 hours. Nothing on that scale had existed anywhere before it. And here's the thing to hold in your mind about all of it. Every acre of that plant, every conveyor, every furnace, every single share of the company that owned it belonged to one family. Henry Ford had done what no industrialist of his size had ever quite managed. Other titans answered to shareholders, to bankers, to boards. Ford answered to no one. He had built an empire the size of a small nation's economy, and he owned the whole of it, alone, with his wife and his son, and not one other soul holding a claim on a single share. That was the peak. Not a number in a ledger, the ledger did not exist, but a fact of pure ownership. A great fortune poured into a single company, and that company held in a single family's hands. It was total, and total was the very problem that was coming. How rich was he at the height? The honest answer is that the era could only guess, and its guesses tell you everything. One of the most read newspaper columnists in America, Arthur Brisbane, told readers outright that Ford had the income on at least 4 billions. It was hyperbole, and no one could prove it wrong. The company was private, and the man said nothing. More than 100,000 people drew their wages at the Rouge alone. Whatever the true figure was, it was large enough that not even the government could rule Henry Ford out. This time, the threat was not a rival or a court. It was one line in the tax code, and a birthday no man can postpone. In August of 1935, Roosevelt signed the Revenue Act, the so-called Wealth Tax Act. It raised the tax on the biggest estates to 70%, 70 cents of every dollar left above 50 million. Henry Ford was 72. His fortune bound up inside one company. When he died, paying it could mean selling the company itself. Dying rich had become the most dangerous thing he could do. And this is the structural trap that Henry Ford, of all men, had built for himself. His genius had been concentration. One company, one product, one man in command, no partners, no bankers, no outside shareholders. That concentration was the source of all his power. It was also the source of the danger. A fortune spread across many things can lose one of them and survive. A fortune sunk into a single asset can survive almost anything. A depression, a strike, a lawsuit, anything except the death of the one man who holds it. Because the day he dies, the government values it, sends the bill, and the family must sell the very thing the fortune was built on to keep it. Henry Ford had made his own mortality the greatest threat his company would ever face. By now there was a son. Edsel Ford had held the presidency for more than 15 years, the title, Never the Power. To see why 1935 was such a trap, you have to go back 16 years to the event that had made the Fords the sole owners of their own company. In 1919, a group of outside shareholders led by the Dodge brothers sued Henry Ford, arguing that he was hoarding the company's profits instead of paying them out. In February of that year, the Michigan Supreme Court agreed in the main. Henry Ford's response was anything but graceful. It was to buy every last one of them out and never answer to an outside shareholder again. He purchased the 8,300 shares held by the outsiders for just over $105 million, about $12,500 a share, a staggering sum for the day. And when it was finished, the Ford Motor Company was owned outright by three people: Henry, his wife Clara, and their son Edsel. No public shareholders, no board of outsiders, not one soul anywhere on earth with a legal claim to a single share of it. Almost no American family had ever held an industrial empire this large and this whole. 100% of one of the biggest companies in the world in three pairs of hands. It was a concentration of ownership the country had seldom seen before or since. And it was that very purity, that total undiluted family ownership, that would turn the 1935 tax law from a nuisance into an existential threat. Everything the Fords had, they had in one basket. And now the government had told them just what it would cost to pass that basket on. So Henry and Edsel Ford did something that looks like madness. In 1935, they had the company's lawyers restructure the stock. Every one of the company's 172,625 shares was split into 20 new shares, but not 20 of the same kind. Each old share became 1 share of voting stock, Class B, and 19 shares of non-voting stock, Class A. When the arithmetic settled, the non-voting Class A was 95% of the company, the voting Class B, the other 5. Then, in January of 1936, they chartered a new organization to receive the 95%, the Ford Foundation, born with a gift of $25,000 and built to swallow almost the whole company. The Fords wrote their wills so that the non-voting stock, the 95%, all the value and none of the control, would go to the foundation, and the voting stock, the 5% that ran the company, would stay with the family. Under that law, 70 cents of every dollar over 50 million would go to the government. The Fords made certain there would be no dollars over 50 million left to tax. They gave the value away and kept the votes. It was lawful, it was deliberate, and it worked just as written. And then the design began to execute itself in the only way such a design can ever work, through a series of funerals. The first was the one nobody had planned for. Edsel Ford, the son, the president, the man who was supposed to inherit all of it and run it at last, died on the 26th of May, 1943. He was 49 years old. For his entire life, he had been president in title, while his father held the power, and he died before he ever once held it himself. He was, by every account, a gentle and private man in a family of hard ones, and the record he left behind is thin, as though he had passed through the middle of an empire almost without leaving a fingerprint. The heir was gone, and the old man was still alive. So Henry Ford, almost 80 and long past his best, took his company back. For 2 years, the aging founder presided over a firm that was drifting into ruin, its daily affairs falling to a hard man named Harry Bennett, who commanded Ford's private security force. It could not hold. In 1945, Edsel's eldest son came home to save the family company. Henry Ford II was 28 years old. On the 21st of September, 1945. His grandfather retired, and the young man was made president of the Ford Motor Company. One of his very first acts was to fire Harry Bennett. The third generation had taken the wheel, and then, on the 7th of April, 1947, Henry Ford died at Fair Lane, his estate in Dearborn, at the age of 83. There is a detail about that night almost too fitting to be true, and yet it is documented. The River Rouge had flooded and knocked out the power to the house, so that the man who had done more than any other to electrify the American century died by candlelight and the glow of kerosene lamps, as though the century he had buried had reached up for a moment to reclaim him. Now the wills did their work. Edsel's will, and then his father's, did just what the 1936 design required of them. The non-voting class, a stock, the 95%, the entire value of the company, flowed out to the Ford Foundation. The voting Class B stock, the 5% that controlled everything, stayed home with the family. By 1950, the Ford Foundation held 3,089,908 shares of non-voting Ford stock. Do the arithmetic, and it comes to 89.5% of the entire company. The family kept the rest of the shares and, above all, every last share of the stock that carried a vote. The foundation now owned all but the whole company. It owned not a single vote in it. Understand what that meant in plain cash. In 1950 alone, the non-voting stock the foundation now held paid it $86.6 million in dividends, $28 on every share, in a single year. Overnight, an institution chartered a decade and a half earlier with a gift of $25,000 became one of the wealthiest philanthropies in the world, floating on a river of Ford dividends. It would spend that money, for the next 70 years, on schools and scholarships and causes scattered across the whole earth, almost none of them ever chosen by a Ford. The money had left the family. It had gone just where Henry and Edsel had signed it to go. The fortune was now the foundation's. The company was still the family's. That was the entire idea. And almost no one outside a small room of lawyers had yet grasped just how well it had all worked. So let me ask you something before we go on. If you could keep your family's name on the door forever, the company, the control, the chair, but almost every dollar of the fortune had to walk out that door to do it, would you sign? Hold that thought. For the next generation, Henry Ford II ran the Ford Motor Company, and he ran it well. He rebuilt a firm that had all but fallen apart in his grandfather's last years into a modern industrial corporation, professional managers, real accounting, a company that could compete with General Motors instead of only resenting it. He put his own name and his own decades into it, and it survived because he did. But here's the strange thing happening at the very same time, on the other side of the family's great division. The Ford Foundation, holding almost the entire value of the company, had become a power in its own right, and it did not answer to the Fords. It hired its own professional staff, its own presidents, its own board of trustees, and it began giving the family's fortune away on a scale the world had seldom witnessed. In 1955, the foundation approved about $65 million in grants. The very next year, as it began to sell its Ford stock, that figure leapt to $557 million, a ninefold jump in a single 12 months. Money earned building automobiles in Michigan now flowed to universities, to hospitals, to artists and researchers and foreign governments, directed by the foundation's own presidents and trustees, men who were not Fords, and did not work for Fords, and did not have to ask a Ford. The family had signed the value away, and the value had grown legs and walked off to lead a life all its own. The Fords still controlled the company. They no longer controlled the fortune. It had become somebody else's money to give away. Now watch the 95% take its leave. A charity is built to spend, and to spend it had to sell. So in January of 1956, for the first time in 53 years, Ford stock was offered to the public. On the 26th of that month, the foundation sold 10,200,000 shares, about 22% of what it held, at $63 a share. A single sale of $642 million in 1956 money, the first public slice of the kingdom Henry Ford had guarded for 37 years. And it was only the first step. The foundation had announced a program to leave Ford stock altogether, and over 18 years it did, from more than 88% of the company at the start, down to 11% by 1972, and 7% the year after. Then, in 1974, it sold the very last of it. And here's a detail almost no one knows. It did not dump those last shares on the market. It sold them in private back to Ford itself and to the bank running the savings plan for Ford's own employees. When the counting was done, the foundation reported that since that first offering, it had sold, granted, and exchanged 92.7 million shares, realizing $4.2 billion. That was the 95%, in the foundation's own words, everything the family had signed away, given to the world. It was gone. The break, when it came, was the sons. By the 1970s, the foundation had drifted so far from the family that built it that the family began to leave. Benson Ford, Henry II's brother, resigned from the board in March of 1976. And on the 11th of December that same year, Henry Ford II resigned as well, ending more than 40 years in which a Ford had always sat on the foundation's board. He left with a letter to his fellow trustees, printed a month later, a remarkable document, a man scolding the very institution his family's money had built for forgetting where that money came from. The foundation existed, he reminded them, only because of the wealth thrown off by private enterprise. In effect, he wrote, the foundation is a creature of capitalism, and he no longer believed the people running it understood that. Then he was gone. It would be more than 40 years until 2019 before another Ford sat on that board. And there is one last irony in it. The foundation's own official history, its proud 90-year timeline, makes no mention of the day it sold the last of its Ford stock, or of the day Henry Ford II walked out. The family had given the foundation everything, and it had grown into something that no longer quite remembered them. So what stayed? The physical things, in the main. Fair Lane, the 56-room house where Henry died, still stands on its grounds in Dearborn, a national landmark run today by a non-profit and closed for its restoration. The museum he founded, with his name across the front of it, still draws its crowds. The company still bears the name, still builds the trucks, still pays its dividend into the family's accounts 4 times a year. These are real things, and they are not nothing. But set them beside what left. On one side of the ledger, a great house, a museum, a name, and a stream of dividends on a sliver of stock. On the other side, everything the foundation carried out the door. Now here's the number itself. The descendants of Henry Ford, Bill Ford, his sisters, his cousins, the whole of the living family hold Class B stock worth, at recent prices, about $1.8 billion. That is the family's stake in the company. And the foundation they filled and then let go? It holds $16 billion and gives away $500 million every single year to strangers forever. $16 billion against $1.8, the endowment against the family's stake. They gave away about $9 for everyone they kept, and what it bought was the one thing Henry Ford would never sell. Under 2% of the company, 40% of the vote, 37 votes to your 1. Now you can see just what happened, and it is not what the word lost suggests. Nobody took it from the Fords, no crash swept it away, no foolish heir gambled it away, no enemy, no court, no scandal emptied the vaults. It was signed away by design, within the law, in the open, by the 2 men who understood it best, and it did just what they built it to do. Offered a choice between the money and the company, they chose the company without blinking. The fortune was the price of the throne. They paid it in full, and they paid it on purpose. Now look at what they bought. Start with the mechanism, because it is a small marvel of engineering. When Henry and Edsel split the stock in 1935, the 5% the family kept was not just any 5%. It was all of the votes. That structure has never once been undone. It has survived 70 years, a public offering, and the death of every single person who signed it. And it is still, right now, just how the Ford Motor Company is controlled. Here's how it works today. The company has issued almost 4 billion shares of ordinary common stock, the kind anyone can buy, and about 71 million shares of a second, special class, the Class B. Only a Ford may own Class B. The rules written into the company's own charter say these shares may be held only by the descendants of Henry Ford and their trusts. If a Class B share should ever pass to an outsider, it turns at once into ordinary common stock the moment it leaves the family. And those 71 million family shares carry, by law, 40% of all the votes in the company. About 4 billion public shares carry the other 60. Do the division, and it is almost comic. A single share of Class B is entitled, at the company's most recent count, to 37 votes for every 1 vote a share of the common stock would get you. That is control without ownership, written down on paper and made permanent. And the family has gone to remarkable lengths to keep it permanent. Almost all of that Class B stock, 99.9% of it, is locked away inside a single voting trust, an arrangement the company itself describes as being of perpetual duration, run by 4 family trustees who must vote the entire block the way a plurality of them decides. It is a machine built for one purpose alone, to make certain the family always speaks with a single voice and can never be pried apart, 1 share at a time, by anyone on the outside. But a machine like that has a weakness, and the family knows just what it is. The same rules that grant them 40% of the vote also say that if the number of Class B shares ever falls too far, that power drains away. Let the family's Class B holdings slip below a set floor, and their share of the vote slides by rule from 40% down toward 30%. Let it fall further still, and the special stock collapses into ordinary one-vote shares, just like everyone else's. The throne is real, but it is conditional. It has a number attached to it, a line the family must never allow its holdings to fall beneath. Which is why, if you listen to the current head of the family, you hear a man defending that line without fanfare. Bill Ford, William Clay. Ford Jr., the founder's great-grandson, has run the family's side of the company since he became its chairman in 1999, and he has been candid, on the record, about what holding the throne now takes. Other family businesses, he has said, fall apart from the inside, from infighting, or just from the heirs losing interest across the generations. He was determined not to let the Ford family's interest ebb away. So the family has been buying up the ownership of relatives who are not so interested and consolidating it into a smaller, committed group. Read that again for a moment. To hold the vote, the engaged Fords are buying out the disengaged ones, one cousin at a time, keeping the family's block well above its floor. The concentration Henry Ford achieved in 1919 with a $105 million buyout, his descendants are now defending, share by share, a full century later. And it has held. Consider the company Henry Ford kept, set against the companies he outlasted. General Motors' founding family is gone from it altogether. Chrysler's founding family is gone. The Dodge brothers, who sued Henry Ford and were bought out in 1919, took their money and left the automobile business for good. Every great name that Ford once came up alongside has long since sold out, merged away, or faded from any control of the thing it built. The Fords are still in the chair. By the company's own reckoning, the family has more than 121 years of continuous, active involvement in the Ford Motor Company, and today 3 of them sit on its board. Bill Ford as executive chairman, his daughter Alexandra Ford English, and Henry Ford III, the last 2 both great-great-grandchildren of the founder, both elected in 2021, the 5th generation taking up its seats. When the foundation sold that first block of stock back in 1956, the offering document had to explain to brand new investors why on earth they were buying shares with almost no power to vote. Those who had owned the company, it said, had agreed to relinquish their exclusive right to vote in the affairs of management. It was a lawyer's careful way of describing the bargain Henry Ford had struck with the future. Outsiders could have the profits, and the family would keep the say. 70 years later, that is still the very arrangement. And Bill Ford, asked why any of it should matter, does not talk about the money at all. I think it's really important that the family legacy continue, he has said. It gives us a face, and maybe a humanity that a lot of other companies don't have. The money is long gone. The face is still there. That, in the end, is what the fortune bought. Think back to where we began. A Ford still heads the company, a century and more on, while the list that once ranked them among America's richest families last placed them at number 129. Both things are true, and now you know why. The fortune was not lost to a crash or a careless heir. They gave it away, on purpose, to buy the one thing Henry Ford ever wanted. Not the money, but the company itself. The name over the door and the chair at the table. They gave up one of the great fortunes in American history, and they kept every vote that mattered. Bill Ford said as much in an interview in the summer of 2025, speaking for the generations before him who had made the same choice. People know there's a family there, he said. We're accountable. Our name is on the product, and they know we care deeply. The fortune was the price. The name was the point.